We have today at Elcano Institute Hussein Kassim. Hussein is a professor of European Public Policy and Administration at the University of Warwick. He is also a fellow at the very important program, a UK in a Changing Europe, in which he is the senior analyst for a new project on that program, Living with the Neighbors. So it's a research on bilateral relations between UK and member states, but also relation between the UK and the European Union institutions. So the first question, Hussein, apart from welcoming you to the Institute, is asking about your assessment 8 years after the referendum, so already 8 years. Which is your assessment about how Brexit has worked?
Well, that's a huge question.
It is.
Many of the benefits that were promised have, I think it's fair to say, not materialised. If you look at trade, and there's a lot of independent evidence here from a lot of UK observatories, but also government institutions. I'm thinking here of the OBR and the ONS, have shown that there's been a big trade hit. That's up to sort of 5% of GDP, but sort of 15% of exports also have been lost. Of course, it's also fair to say that those reports mention Brexit, mention COVID, but also mention the war in Ukraine as other sort of complicating factors to sort of clearly attribute these to Brexit. But I think the politics is where it's also been very interesting, because there have been very few Brexit dividends, it seems. Things that are celebrated as huge and tremendous successes, headlined by governments such as renegotiated trade agreements, the bilaterals at more than 30 with EU member states, much heralded, much talked about evidence of UK's freedom, exercising its new freedoms. But actually, when you sort of scrutinise them individually, it's very hard to see that they deliver a great deal more than what was had before. There's been a difficult transition of sort of regulatory agencies, regulatory bodies of state more broadly. So functions and responsibilities have returned to the UK as a consequence. They have imposed quite considerable costs on what we might describe as the state, and sort of populating, finding the right level of resource for those offices has been very, very difficult. Some have been designed ab initio, such as in environment, for example, and the structure, the powers, the responsibility, the internal organisation. The resource has been much criticised because it seems to be much weaker than than the obligations that the UK was under. I think that there's also something about our politics that's important to mention, which is that I think it would be hard to deny that there has been a kind of a strong populist element to Brexit and to Brexitism. That's a term that was introduced to us by Alan Finlayson, but also is used by Chris Gray, and that describes a kind of politics which isn't necessarily evidence-based anymore, which is sort of quite performative in many ways, which doesn't really take expertise at face value, which is quite ideologically driven, where sort of mobilising sort of public opinion is a key thing, and where reference to the referendum mandate is the all-powerful answer to where we are. So that's quite a lot of things. I think the main, in terms of policy change, the main change really has been in immigration. So of course, free movement was one of those things where the sort of argument for leave was strongest. There have been quite a sort of a new policy points-based regime was introduced. What's curious is that immigration numbers haven't diminished at all, in fact quite the opposite, but the balance of immigration has changed. So there are many more people from outside Europe than there are from than there were historically, and many from much fewer from within Europe.
We have in early July, we have a new UK general election. Conservative, try to demonstrate that Brexit was successful, but it doesn't seem it's very high on the manifesto how the relevance they give to Brexit. We have Labour, that according to all opinion polls, Labour Party is going to win the election with a landslide, by the way. But they try to hide their views about Brexit. But Brexit is the elephant in the room. So I would like to ask you about Brexit and the next general elections, which relevance and what is going to make an impact on the result. And also the Lib Dems, the third party that has recently announced that this party is going to push for debate about rejoin, if not the European Union, at least the internal market. So, to what extent is important or not?
Yeah, this is also a sort of curious outcome. You'd imagine that 8 years after the referendum, that the party that brought it to us would be celebrating it. They also brought the oven-ready deal to us and all the Brexit opportunities. But it's mentioned in the Conservative Party manifesto. But in some ways it's more of the same. So more trade agreements, more bilaterals, and getting rid of red tape, essentially. So some of the headlines, but it's not the main issue. It's not something that I think the Prime Minister or ministers of the current government would seek to draw attention to. So that's somewhat mysterious. I think it tells you something about how the polls have changed on this. How there's support not just for the support for joining the EU. That's significant, but also regret for having left the EU. That's what you find very significantly. And you find on the Conservative side, you find a sort of refusal to accept any downsides that actually that Brexit hasn't delivered anything but opportunity and freedoms and all of that. Although it's very hard to find evidence of those things. On the Labour Party side, there's the sort of the caricature of carrying the Ming vase, that the vote is very precious, that victory can be achieved, but disaster has to be avoided, and the very specific challenge that the Labour Party needs to win back power is to win back the so-called Red Wall. All those seats that were lost to the Conservative Party in 2019, and it looked as if they'd be lost, in some ways forever, in political terms, forever. So the Labour Party does have to win back those seats. Perhaps this explains its caution on Europe. I think the experience of referendum also does that, because the referendum was divisive in our politics. There's no doubt about that. So its proposals are relatively modest. It's already ruled out rejoining the customs union or the single European market. It certainly ruled out rejoining. I think that the person who would be Chancellor was cited as saying it won't happen in the next 50 years, if it ever happens at all.
50
years. There's a lot of. In a way, this reflects something that Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was Brexit Opportunities Minister and a Leaver, argued that we wouldn't feel the benefits for another 50 years. So 50 years is a new element of accountancy, I suppose, in our British politics. But what the Labour Party have said, I think most firmly, is pact in defence and security with the EU. So institutionalising cooperation, because there are a lot of common threats. There's already a lot of cooperation on the part of the UK bilaterally with European states, member states, but also the EU. A lot of close cooperation with respect to Ukraine, for example. Also talked about is SPS alignment. Though that's challenging. That's really challenging. It would make the Northern Ireland sort of protocol and even the Windsor framework easier to manage, but it would require a very courageous incoming government to make the case for the benefits to business, but also the acceptability of the dynamic alignment EU rules that it would entail, and also it would require an argument to be made for the supremacy of the European Court of Justice, which of course was one of the red lines. We were taking back control over our borders, laws and money, and so that ruled out European Court of Justice jurisprudence. That's a second area. There's also been talk about professional qualifications. Also, I think that one of the challenges for any government, however, is not just the difficulty of persuading the British public. We've got to bear in mind that that there's always a reference back to the mandate delivered by the referendum. There's also a lot of people who are sort of policing Brexit in the Conservative Party and beyond in the media. But there's also EU constraints. The EU still sees the UK as a demandeur. It's very firm about the sort of principles that it first enunciated in June 2016, shortly after the referendum, where it talks about cakeism and the need, avoiding cakeism and the need to balance obligations and with any benefits. So that's very, very, very important. And I think that in terms of sort of cashing that out, what that means is not offering to the UK anything that's a kind of free lunch. There's got to be reciprocity, for example. So even things like freedom of movement for touring musicians, which was offered during the negotiations. That was one thing, but now we're in a different era where reciprocity has to be offered. So that's also challenging. That will make things difficult for any government.
Well, so to try to end with an optimistic perspective, even if expectation must be modest, realistic, but do you foresee better relation in the next 5 years? We are going to have a new cycle of the European Union with a new parliament, new commission, and the British side, a new parliament and a new government. So what do you expect for the next 5 years?
Yes, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens on the EU side, who's in senior office. If Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has a second term, she already had good relationships with London, and I think you could expect that to continue. I think generally the mood music on both sides will be better. I don't think you'll see this kind of hostile rhetoric that we've had over the last 8 years from London. I think it might be more difficult though to make things work. I mean, there's been a lot of thought about how to improve relations, but I think even getting to the sort of early stages, even getting to the so-called sort of low-hanging fruit, requires a real commitment on the part of the incoming government to engage with the British public, to try and make arguments, make debates, to sort of challenge in a way views, ideas that have become sort of established over the last few years, and demonstrate there's value and virtue in so doing, because that's something that's been absent from our politics for a number of years now, certainly absent from the mainstream. Or the two major parties, I should say. It's true, you mentioned earlier that the Lib Dems are arguing that the UK ought to rejoin the EU. I think it's helpful to have that voice in the room. It might kind of normalise the importance of having a good relationship with your nearest neighbours, and it would also sort of simplify tremendously a lot of the sort of the challenges that have come out of Brexit. I mean, I'm thinking here of what you lose as a member state. The close and easy contact with all of the other member states that you see routinely
every day in Brussels.
Every day in Brussels across the whole range of areas. I mean, this is something. For example, I've heard Irish diplomats talk about that you have this very important Good Friday Agreement to marshal police to implement, and but you haven't any longer got that. They've got the opportunity to meet people in the corridors before and after council meetings.
No longer the case.
It's no longer the case, and so you have to make a particular effort. And some of the work that I've done with Cleo Davis on the project, which looks at the bilaterals, some of it asks, whether the UK can have the resources to sort of manage those 27 different bilateral relationships, or the 26 bilateral relationships, and the 27 with the EU. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of person power. Whereas previously, I'm not going to say that there wasn't a lot of effort involved in getting your officials to Brussels or not. But you had access. You were inside the room. There were a lot of advantages that flowed from that.
Absolutely.
That's also something that I think is important for an incoming government to point out.
Well, so thank you very much for visiting us. Thank you very much for your research.
Thank you.
It's really important for all of us. And you are always welcome at the Institute.
Thank you very much. That's kind of you.